Hello, bakers and bakettes. Welcome back to Queen's Appetit. Today we're going to be making a very special recipe for the fall season. We're going to be making maple cheesecake bars swirled with sweet potato pie. I know y'all are drooling. Just look at that. So because we're making a sweet potato pie and a cheesecake, there's going to be a ton of ingredients. So I'm just going to walk you guys through each part of this recipe step by step, and I'll include a link to all the ingredients and measurements down below, along with the link to the full written recipe. But before we begin, if you're interested in learning how to bake or cook, swirl that like button and subscribe to the channel for more delicious recipes. Now let's get baking. So the first thing we're going to do is make our Gingersnap Crust. I'm using these hard Gingersnap cookies. You don't want to use that soft stuff. And I used a full package, which was about 43. For the crust, we'll also be adding brown sugar, ground cinnamon, and melted butter. Let's start with crushing our Gingersnap cookies. My food processor isn't very big, so I had to crush them half at a time. Just throw them in there and blend, blend, blend. You want them to look super fine like this. Don't leave any chunks. Then once we've got our yummy spiced crumbs, we're going to keep it in our food processor and add our brown sugar and cinnamon. Pulse a few times to blend them together. Then we're going to pour in our melted butter and pulse until all the crumbs are coated. You may need to use a spoon to help assist to make sure everything is coated, and once it is, it'll look like this. You can see the crumbs are already sticking together. This is what you want. Now go ahead and preheat your oven to 350 because we're going to be baking our crust first. I have a 9 by 13 inch cake pan here that I sprayed with nonstick spray and lined with parchment paper. You can use foil paper if you want, but whatever you use, I recommend you have enough hanging over the sides so that you could lift them out of the pan and easily slice them when they're done. Flatten your crumbs into an even layer. I like to use the flat bottom of a measuring cup for this. Then I use my fingers to flatten out the edges. Once you're happy with the evenness of your crust, you're going to throw it in the oven for 10 minutes to allow the crust to harden. While the crust is in the oven, we can get started on the brown butter sweet potato pie filling. To make the sweet potato pie, we'll be using unsalted butter. Make sure it's softened to room temperature. Next, we're going to be using a pound of sweet potatoes that have been scrubbed clean, brown sugar, vanilla extract, some warm spices. We've got cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, and a bit of salt, heavy cream, 2 eggs, and some cornstarch. Let's start with browning the butter. Place your butter pieces into a small saucepan over medium heat and wait for it to melt. Make sure your pan has a light bottom so that it's easier to see when the butter changes color. Once your butter melts, it's going to start bubbling and foaming. Just keep a close eye on it and stir it around. It's going to foam up a lot for the first few minutes, but eventually the foam will subside and you'll start to see the milk solids at the bottom of your pan. This is what you're really going to want to pay attention to, because once those milk solids turn golden brown, it's ready. The time this takes really depends. It took me 10 minutes this time, but when I use my regular stove, it can take as little as 5 minutes. So don't worry about the timing, just use your eyes to know when it's ready, because if you set a timer and leave it alone, it can burn and you don't want that. And then this right here is perfect, so we're going to immediately take it off the stove and pour it into a separate bowl to stop the cooking process. Scrape every bit into the bowl. You want all of that flavor to be in your sweet potato pie. Now we're going to take our brown butter and place it into the refrigerator to solidify. It'll still be soft since it's melted butter. Now we need to soften the sweet potatoes. For the first method, place your sweet potatoes into a pot filled with water. Turn on the heat and let them boil for 45 minutes to an hour. When your potatoes are super soft, they should easily slip off of a fork like this. Remove them from the water and set them aside to cool for a few minutes so you could comfortably peel off the skin. Another method you could use is baking the sweet potatoes. Some people say this makes the potatoes more flavorful, so if you want to try this method instead, go right ahead. Preheat your oven to 400 degrees, then use a fork to prick holes all over your sweet potatoes. You can either bake them on a foil-lined baking sheet like this, or you could individually wrap them in the foil and bake them on the baking sheet. You'll need to bake them for around the same time of 45 minutes to an hour. Again, do the fork test to make sure they slip off easily and they're nice and soft. Now it's time to finally make that yummy sweet potato pie. You want to start by beating the sweet potatoes just to mash them up. I actually recommend mashing them with a potato masher and then pushing them through a fine mesh strainer so it's not stringy or chunky. I totally forgot to do this unfortunately, but it still turned out amazing regardless. So if you don't feel like doing all those extra steps, you don't have to. Now we're going to add the rest of the sweet potato pie ingredients, including our amazing solidified brown butter, and mix it all together. Now it's time for the final component in our recipe, the maple cheesecake. For the cheesecake, we're going to be using cream cheese, brown sugar, cornstarch, sour cream, maple syrup, vanilla, and eggs. You want to use 3 whole eggs and 1 egg yolk. Using a clean pair of beaters, mix your cream cheese until it's creamy and smooth. Make sure it's really soft. I let mine sit out for an hour before I started. Now go ahead and add your brown sugar and cornstarch and mix it all up. I like to use brown sugar instead of white sugar for this because it gives our cheesecake a nice little flavor boost. Make sure to scrape the sides and bottom of your bowl just so we can make sure everything is getting mixed in properly. Then add the sour cream, maple syrup, and vanilla. Don't even bother using that cheap table syrup. If you value your taste buds, use the pure 100% maple syrup. You'll thank yourself later. Mix that in slowly until it's all combined, then you're going to add your eggs one at a time. Give the batter a few good stirs just to see if it needs to be mixed more. As you can see, mine still had a few little lumps, so I just beat it for a few more seconds. Now we're going to take our trusty ice cream scoop and scoop random dollops of cheesecake batter over our Gingersnap Crust. Then I got a second trusty ice cream scoop. That wasn't as good, I'll be honest, but it worked. And for the sweet potato pie batter, we're going to scoop dollops into the cheesecake dollops and add some to the empty spots. Now we're going to repeat with the cheesecake batter and alternate between both until both batters are done. So scoop the cheesecake onto the sweet potato pie, then the pie on the cheesecake. You know the deal by now. Now take a butter knife and swirl, swirl, swirl. You want to do a back and forth motion like this to give the top of our cheesecake a pretty little design. Finally, we are going to bake our cheesecake in a preheated 350-degree oven for 40 to 45 minutes. And when it's done, it should look like this. Set around the sides, but still slightly jiggly in the middle. That'll set up as it cools. Speaking of, let it cool at room temperature for an hour, then in the refrigerator for 8 hours or overnight. Then carefully lift it out of the pan and slice. And here they are, sweet potato swirled maple cheesecake bars. This is definitely a treat you have to make at least once. It's an incredible Thanksgiving dessert idea. Let me show you the layers. We got our spiced Gingersnap Crust, rich maple cheesecake, and swirls of brown butter sweet potato pie all throughout each bar. I'm on a diet, I shouldn't be eating this stuff, but I just had to have a bite. And you know I had to have a second bite. And maybe a third. And a fourth. And that'll last a little bit just to make it look even, of course. I hope you enjoyed this recipe. It was super fun to make. If you made it yourself, please let me know in the comments below and subscribe if you'd like to see more yummy recipes.